Hello and welcome to the Horticulturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I am Matthew Lucas.
And we are doing a collaborative video today with Alexandra Campbell from the Middle-Sized Garden. So Alexandra, thank you for including us in this foray into
Indoor-outdoor plants. So on this video, Alexandra is going to be talking about the type of plants that can perhaps transition from an indoor plant to an outdoor setting in Britain and parts of North America. And we are going to be doing the same thing here in Australia. The sort of plants that you can grow indoors or outdoors or not.
Yes, as the case may be.
So Alexandra, we'll give you our take on the plants that you're listing, and we have 3 plants that you might not have considered that can go both indoors and outdoors here in Australia.
Fantastic.
Plants. And Stephen, we are outdoors. What is before us?
Well, this plant here is sort of related to a very well-known group of indoor plants, which are the peperomias.
Very fashionable.
Very fashionable.
Very desirable right now. Yes.
And bringing huge prices in some cases as well. This is a plant called Piper excelsa. It used to be called macro piper, meaning a big piper, and it's the New Zealand pepperbush. And it makes a great pot plant, and it's also good in basically frost-free environments as an understory shrub in the garden.
And as an indoor plant, what kind of light does it need?
It will tolerate quite low light levels, and it doesn't need a lot of watering, and it's fairly easy care.
What more could you want? Well, Alexandra, we're looking forward to seeing what you have and our take on some of those plants.
Yeah.
It's Alexandra from the Middle-Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'm here at a wonderful indoor plant shop called Forest in South London. And Maddie and Alice Bailey, who are here, have written a book called The Green Indoors. And so we're going to give you the advice that you need to know if you're going to treat these plants as indoor plants, and the horticulturalists, Stephen and Matthew, are going to give us the advice we need if you're going to treat them as outdoor plants. And what do we need to know about philodendrons as an indoor plant?
Philodendrons, so there's a few different varieties. Although they're known to be a shade-loving plant, I've actually found they do really well in quite a bright spot too. They require a little bit more water than the kind of fleshier, thicker-leaved plants. So you want to water them once about the top inch of soil's dried out. But actually, they're fairly tough. As long as they don't go below 15 degrees, they tend to be fine.
So, what do you think, Stephen and Matthew? Let us know your advice if you're going to grow it in your garden.
Philodendron, Stephen, inside, outside. We are outside, clearly.
Yes. Now, this is really pushing things in my climate.
Yep.
I probably shouldn't have this Philodendron salome or Thaumatophyllum bipinnatifidum, as it is now called.
Oh my goodness!
How was that? I got it out without stumbling. So this is very frost tender and will grow well outdoors in Melbourne, not so well outdoors up at Macedon, where we're much colder. And the same probably applies to the Monstera deliciosa, which is probably one of the world's most popular indoor plants.
Yes.
They're both on about a par hardiness wise. So they're good in Melbourne, where you get no actual frosts. Where you get even a light level of frost, they are problematic.
And obviously as indoor plants, they are sensational because they're tough, resilient,
They are tough, yep.
all manner of conditions.
The only issue with them, I guess, is that they can grow quite large, so you do need to have a reasonably large room for them, and neither of them seem to enjoy things like air conditioners and heaters, things like that.
True, true, true. And I've actually got some amazing footage of Monstera deliciosa growing in Melbourne in Fitzroy Gardens, also growing with this philodendron, and it's been used as an understory plant, which I guess it is in the wild, isn't it?
It is. What both these plants will do in the wild is they'll grow underneath the trees and shrubs, so they're reasonably drought tolerant because they hold a lot of moisture in the plant.
Right.
And then as time goes on, if they find a trunk to lean against, they will start climbing, and then they become this amazing climbing plant growing up the trunk of the tree.
Yes. So in fact, they are a good dry shade understory plant.
As long as you don't get massive frost.
As long as you're not in a frosty area. Okay, on to the next.
There's one plant I really remember from the 1970s, from all the kind of student flats and things, and that's the Monstera deliciosa. And it must be pretty tough to have survived the 1970s, I think. So what are your recommendations on keeping it now indoors?
They've had a real resurgence.
They've had a real resurgence.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, they're just such a wonderful houseplant. They're really, really easy to care for. The brighter the light, the kind of bigger the leaves will get, but they can also tolerate quite a lot of deep shade. Minimal watering again, although a little bit more than the kind of thicker, fleshier fleshier plants, so once about half the pot of soil is dried out. But the key thing is a little bit of moisture in the air. They don't want to be anywhere too dry, but they're not bothered about really high levels of humidity. In general, they're just a very low maintenance house plant and will take a bit of neglect.
A few plants which have got a huge number of varieties, and I think basically some of them do for indoors and some do for outdoors, but I'd just quite like to know your advice on those. And the first one of those is begonias. Now, what would you advise to people wanting begonias inside?
Inside. So there are a few tropical varieties of begonia, particularly the maculata, which is a really popular one. The maculata has really beautiful foliage, but very delicate, so it wouldn't do so well outside in a kind of more moderate climate like the UK. But there are varieties such as the Rex, which could be both indoors and outdoors. Certain varieties, again, do better than others, but generally you get a good crossover with begonias.
And over to Stephen Matthew for their advice.
Begonias, Mr. Ryan.
Now there is a huge subject, potentially.
Yes.
Because you've got a whole range of different types of begonias.
Yes.
There's the coloured leafed ones,
Yes.
which are commonly known as Rex begonias, and
Yes.
they're evergreen. They make good indoor plants. They're not terribly good outdoor plants.
And I've got some in pots, which we're going to have a look at here. Now, mine are outdoors all year.
Yeah.
They're undercover in Melbourne. And in the Melbourne climate, they don't thrive, let's just say.
No, they get a bit manky looking in the winter.
They get a bit manky. They also get quite mildewed by the end of the season, no matter what you do with them and no matter how fresh the air movement is. So mine just tend to go a bit deciduous, and then I just leave them quite dry, and then they perk up in spring.
Yeah, so that's probably the best way to deal with them. They're probably slightly better indoors where the environment is actually drier.
Right.
So you're less likely to get the mildew problems. The next begonia I would consider as being one that a lot of people might grow are the cane begonias.
Yes.
Now they're pretty tough.
They are. Again, I have those outdoors in pots, but also I see them a lot in gardens, planted outdoors in the soil.
Yep. They're perfectly good garden plants in basically frost-free environments.
Yep.
And they can make rather splendid house plants with that sort of upright form that they have. Great foliage, very attractive flowers, so they're definitely worth considering for both indoor-outdoor culture in Australia.
And easy to propagate from cuttings, super easy.
Almost too easy.
Which brings us to tuberous begonias.
Yes, now tuberous begonias are a little bit more complicated.
Are they?
Well,
I thought they'd be easier.
No, they're not really. They die down during the winter months.
Yeah.
So you've got to keep the tubers dry.
Yes.
So you've got to understand their growth pattern. So as they start to collapse in the late autumn, you need to dry them out, tip the pot on its side, stick it somewhere where it's not going to get too much cold. And of course, therein is the issue as a houseplant, because they spend a fair bit of time not being an attractive houseplant. When they do start to grow, water them from the bottom, don't water the foliage, and make sure they get plenty of light. They don't want too much direct sunlight, and they will need repotting each year as they're coming up. So you'll need to put them in fresh potting mix with some slow release fertilizer. And so they're not a long term or not a full 12-month cycle plant as an indoor plant, unfortunately. And although they're used as bedding plants in England quite a bit, they don't seem to work terribly well as bedding plants here. I've only ever seen them a few times and they don't do terribly well.
No, that's true. You rarely see begonias used that way here. I do have some tuberous begonias that are coming up. We'll overlay that footage here. One of them is a species, I think, called Sutherlandii, which is very beautiful, very prone to mildew. Again, luckily, by the time it is so riddled with it, it's dying because it's autumn.
Which is fine,
and I just leave mine to do their thing. I do let the leaves do get moist, though, and I just spray them with water.
Yeah, well, that does encourage mildew, particularly towards the end of the season.
Oops.
So there you go. Now, it's time for us to introduce a plant or two that hasn't come up in this segment.
Yes.
And I thought it would be fun to talk about using some of the Southern Hemisphere conifers as indoor plants.
Yes.
And they do make surprisingly good indoor plants.
I'm struggling with the idea of a conifer as an indoor pot plant, but carry on, Stephen.
All right. Well, things in the Oricariaceae family, Oricarias, Wollemias, those types of plants, agathis, which are the kauri pines, are surprisingly good indoor plants. They'll cope with quite low light levels. They're reasonably vertical, so they don't take up a lot of sideways space. Some of them actually look like Christmas trees, so you could decorate them every Christmas if you wanted to.
I have seen Norfolk Island pines used as Christmas trees. It breaks my heart to some degree, but anyway.
Yeah, well, they do look like a plant that's been put together by a committee. But they are structurally interesting and they do make really good pot plants. And yes, they'll get too big.
They'll
But-
grow into a tree, Stephen.
Yeah, they will eventually grow into a tree. But if I buy a Norfolk Island pine, and I'm not sure what you'd pay for it perhaps in North America or England, but they're probably not hideously expensive. The Wollemi pines are a little dearer, I know, but if I bought one of those and I got 10, 12 years out of it as a pot plant indoors, you can take the tops off them, but they do tend to branch and then become slightly odd
hideous.
shaped.
Yeah.
But if I got 10 or 12 years out of something, I'd be quite proud of myself, and then I'd pass it on to the local botanic gardens or something like that.
Or the
hopefully
compost heap, because if you what climatic conditions can they take in terms of weather and minimum?
The Wollemi pine's surprisingly hardy.
Yeah.
I've seen it growing in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris,
Oh.
out in the ground, perfectly fine.
Really?
Parts of southern England seem to cope quite well. So it's turning out to have a reasonably good cold
Because
tolerance.
it's quite a high altitude. Its native range is quite high altitude, isn't it?
No, not particularly.
Oh, there you go.
No, it grows in a
Shoot
gorge.
that one down.
Yeah, it grows in a gorge in the Wollemi National Park,
Yes.
not far from Sydney.
Oh.
And so it's in the Blue Mountains, but the Blue Mountains are not particularly high. They don't get a great deal of snow and things like that.
Okay.
But it's been around for a long time, so it's probably been through a couple of ice ages. So I think
it remembers how to deal with the cold.
Yeah, so it's reasonably cold tolerant. The Norfolk Island pine, probably you'd be pushing it to plant it out in the ground in lots of climates, but it certainly copes really well with tropical climates as a tree out in the garden, and
Yeah.
it does make a fantastic pot plant.
There you go. So Stephen, bromeliads are also a brilliant indoor-outdoor plant for us here.
They certainly are, and in fact I'm not sure how this would translate to an indoor environment, but here we've got some that I planted on the side of my fan palm. So
And we made a video about that, which I will link up here. Now, I've got a lot of bromeliads in pots, and we'll overlay that footage just here. So in terms of frost sensitivity, you get quite cold temperatures here.
oh yeah, a lot of the bromeliads are actually more cold hardy than people give them credit for. So they're certainly worth a try, but I don't know whether anybody's really done that much work on which ones will go down to what temperatures. So it may be an
Trial and error.
experimental.
All of mine, though, I have to say that you're seeing now are all outdoors undercover, so they're not rained on, but they do get the low Melbourne winter minimums, which can get down to sometimes 1-2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, but not frosty.
Not frosty. All right.
Well, this particular plant is one of the bromeliads. It's called Bilbergia nutans, and it's one of the toughest of the group. It makes a great outdoor plant in semi-shade to shade. It's very drought tolerant. It makes a big mound, and you get these beautiful pink bracted stems with green and blue flowers. So it's a remarkably unusual colour in a plant. And it makes a good pot plant, and it can be used as an indoor plant very well because it's so tough. So most aspects indoors would suit it.
Stephen, are you much of an indoor plant kind of guy? I'm feeling you're not.
No, I'm not. I have to admit, I live in probably the darkest house you can live in unless you're a troglodyte, and it's not conducive to indoor plant culture. So I don't normally keep plants indoors unless there's something that I put in for their disposable prettiness for the short term.
Like Phalaenopsis orchids.
Yes.
I, however, because we're in a rental while we're building and renovating, I have a lot of things in pots, both indoors but also outdoors undercover. So I am all about pot culture, which is why this has been really interesting for us. So from Piper Excelsa doing well outdoors, and I have one from you in a pot that's doing well. We do post every week, so do hit subscribe. And Stephen?
We look forward to seeing you next week.
We do indeed. See you then.